Elena Marchetti woke before sunrise, the way she had every day for 30 years. She did not need an alarm clock anymore. Her body knew the rhythm of flour and yeast, of ovens that needed to be warmed slowly, of dough that needed patience. The bakery on the corner of 9th and Miller Street had been her whole life since she was 26 years old, back when the neighborhood was full of families who knew each other by name and children who ran errands for candy money. Now the street looked different. Half the shops were closed, their windows covered with old newspaper. New buildings rose a few blocks away, tall and shiny, built by people who had never walked these old sidewalks before they were paved with money. Elena had watched the change happen slowly, the way a person watches their own hair turn gray, until one morning, she looked up and barely recognized the world outside her door. She was wiping down the counter when the envelope arrived. It was thick, official, and cold in the way only legal paper can be. She read it twice before she understood. The building had been sold. She had 30 days to close the bakery and leave. Her hands trembled as she set the letter down. 30 years of early mornings, of teaching her son to knead dough before he could tie his shoes, of feeding a neighborhood through good times and hard times, and now it could all end with a single sheet of paper. She was not ready to give up so easily. Elena picked up the phone and called the number listed at the bottom of the letter. A cold voice told her only that the building now belonged to a man named Vincent Salerno, and that all business was final. She asked to meet him in person. The voice on the other end paused, surprised, then said someone would be in touch. That night, Elena sat alone in the back room of the bakery, surrounded by the smell of cinnamon and old wood. She looked at the small wooden box on the shelf above her desk, the one she never opened in front of anyone. Inside it was a letter, yellowed with age, sealed shut, written by her husband Michael, many years before he passed away. She had never opened it herself. Michael had asked her to keep it safe, and to give it only if the right moment ever came. She did not know what the right moment looked like. She only knew this was not it. Not yet. 3 days later, a black car stopped outside the bakery. Elena expected a lawyer, someone in a stiff suit carrying papers and excuses. Instead, a man stepped out alone. He was tall, with graying hair combed neatly back, and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked at. He wore a dark coat, simple but expensive, the kind of coat that spoke more than words ever could. He introduced himself as Vincent Salerno. Elena had heard the name before, whispered in certain corners of the city with a mixture of fear and respect. People said he controlled more of the neighborhood than any official on a city council ever could. She had expected menace. What she saw instead was a tired man studying the bakery window, as if he were looking for something he had lost a long time ago. She invited him inside, more out of pride than hospitality. She was not going to let fear keep her from defending 30 years of her life. Vincent stepped in, glancing around at the shelves of bread, the small round tables, the faded photographs on the wall showing the bakery through the decades. Elena spoke first. She told him about the years she had spent building this place from nothing, about the customers who had grown up eating her bread, about the promise she made to her husband to keep the ovens burning even after he was gone. Vincent listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his eyes moving slowly across the room as if each object held a memory he could not quite place. When she finished, he said only that business decisions were not personal. The block was being redeveloped. Her building stood in the way of those plans. He told her the decision was already made and could not be undone. Elena felt her chest tighten with anger and grief, but she did not cry in front of him. She had learned long ago that tears rarely change the minds of powerful men. Instead, she nodded and asked if his men could at least wait until she gathered the last of her supplies from the back room before beginning any work on the building. Vincent agreed, then turned to leave. But as his men walked through the narrow hallway to inspect the pipes and walls for the coming demolition, he found himself drawn toward the small back office instead of the front door. He told himself he was simply checking the structure of the building, the way any businessman would, before tearing it down. But something about the room called to him, the smell of flour mixed with old paper, the quiet stillness of a place that had held on to memories for far too long. His eyes landed on the wooden box on the shelf. It was old, its corners worn smooth by years of touching. Something about it made him stop. He reached for it before he even realized what he was doing. Elena rushed in just as he lifted the lid. Her heart dropped. Inside was the sealed letter, yellowed and fragile, with a name written across the front in her husband's careful handwriting. The name was Vincent Salerno. Vincent stared at the envelope for a long moment, his expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. He looked up at Elena, silently asking for an explanation. Elena's voice was quiet as she explained. Her husband Michael had once worked for Vincent's father many years ago, long before Vincent inherited the family's business dealings. Michael rarely spoke about that part of his life, but before he passed away, he had written this letter and asked Elena to keep it safe. He told her that one day, if fate ever brought his family and the Salerno name together again, she should give it to whoever asked for it. Elena had never understood what he meant. She had kept the box on the shelf for years, telling herself she would decide what to do with it when the time was right. She never imagined that time would come through an eviction notice. Vincent's hands were steady as he opened the seal, but his breathing had changed, quicker now, as if the past itself had reached out and touched him. He unfolded the paper carefully and began to read. The words were plain, written in a simple, honest hand. Michael wrote about the winter he had worked as a young delivery driver for Vincent's father, a man everyone in the neighborhood respected and feared in equal measure. He described a night when a rival crew had ambushed him on a dark street, mistaking him for someone else entirely. He wrote about how Vincent's father had personally come to his aid, pulling him away from danger, and later making sure his family was protected and cared for during a difficult winter when work was scarce and money even scarcer. Michael described how deeply that act of kindness had changed his life. He had never been able to repay it, not truly, not in a way that felt equal to what he had received. He carried that debt quietly for the rest of his years, a private weight he never spoke about even to Elena. In the letter, he asked that if the day ever came when the Salerno name crossed paths with his family again, whoever read these words would know that the debt, though never spoken of, was never forgotten either. Vincent read the letter twice, his eyes lingering on certain lines longer than others. When he finally looked up, something in his face had shifted. The cold, calculating businessman who had walked through the door only minutes before seemed to have stepped aside, leaving behind a man remembering stories his own father used to tell him as a boy, stories about loyalty, about the debts that mattered more than money, about a young driver named Michael, who had once needed help on a winter night many years ago. He sat down slowly at one of the small round tables near the window, the letter still held gently in his hands. Elena stood nearby, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. She had spent so many years wondering what secret her husband had carried, and now, watching the weight of it settle onto a stranger's shoulders, she finally understood why he had asked her to wait. Vincent spoke after a long silence, his voice quieter than it had been before. He told her that his father had passed away when he was still young, and much of what he knew about the man came only through stories told by others. He had never heard this particular story, one where his father had shown kindness to a stranger, without expecting anything in return. He admitted that in his line of work, kindness was rarely spoken about, rarely remembered, often buried beneath deals and negotiations, and the constant pressure to appear strong. Hearing his father's compassion described so plainly, in the careful handwriting of a man who had clearly never forgotten it, moved him in a way he had not expected. He folded the letter gently and placed it back into its envelope, holding it as if it were something fragile and precious. He looked around the bakery again, seeing it differently now. It was not just an old building standing in the way of new construction. It was a place where a promise had quietly waited for decades, patient and unspoken, until the right moment finally arrived to be honored. Vincent stood and walked to the counter, where the eviction notice still lay from days before. Without a word, he picked it up, tore it slowly in half, and set the pieces down in front of Elena. He told her the bakery would remain exactly where it was. He said that whatever plans existed for the redevelopment of the block would simply have to work around her building instead of through it. This was not charity, he explained. It was a debt finally being settled, one that had waited far longer than it should have. Elena felt tears rise to her eyes, though she tried to hold them back out of habit. 30 years of worry, of wondering whether she was strong enough to keep her promise to Michael, seemed to lift from her shoulders all at once. She thanked Vincent quietly, her voice thick with emotion she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time. Before he left, Vincent asked if he could visit again sometime, not as a landlord or a businessman, but simply as someone who wanted to know more about the man who had written those words so many years ago. Elena agreed, surprising herself with how easily the words came. There was something about him now that felt different from the man who had walked in that morning. Someone searching quietly for pieces of a father he barely remembered. In the weeks that followed, word slowly spread through the neighborhood about what had happened at Marchetti's bakery. Nobody knew all the details, only fragments passed from one customer to another. Stories about a powerful man who had come to close the bakery and left instead having saved it. Business grew busier than it had been in years, curious visitors stopping in to see the little shop with the big story attached to its name. Elena framed the letter carefully behind glass and hung it near the register, not as a display of pride, but as a quiet reminder of everything it represented. Every morning when she unlocked the doors and turned on the ovens, she glanced at it briefly before beginning her work, remembering Michael's patience, his quiet faith that certain promises find their way to fulfillment, no matter how long they wait. Vincent visited a few more times over the following months, usually in the early morning before the shop grew busy. He would sit quietly with a cup of coffee, sometimes talking about his father, sometimes simply enjoying the smell of fresh bread, in a place that had somehow, against every expectation, brought him closer to a piece of his own history he never knew existed. Elena often thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how a secret carried in silence for so many years had turned out to be the very thing that saved it. She realized that some promises are not meant to be understood right away. They wait patiently, sometimes for decades, until the exact right moment when they are needed most. The bakery continued on, its ovens warm every morning, just as they had been for 30 years, filling the corner of 9th and Miller Street with the smell of fresh bread and the quiet comfort of a story, finally allowed to come full circle.